I've got a small workbench in the basement where I like to do some basic tinkering, especially in the winter when the walk from the house to the shop seems like a recipe for a Mark Popsicle. The most important tool that space was lacking was a decent stool, so I decided to build one and help bump up my laziness status from breeze dodging to master sitter. If any of you have been around the channel long, you'll probably notice something strange about the shop. Well, this is likely the first project I made after moving last year, and I just never got around to putting the video together. So this historical footage makes the shop look a little different than you're used to, but that's just because the place wasn't completely set up yet. After cutting the rough spots out of my lumber, then planing it down to size and cutting my components to their rough dimensions, I could begin shaping the legs. I started by cutting an angle into a scrap piece so I could visualize the end result, and also use this to help set up my tools throughout the process. If you want to build this stool at home, I'll leave a link in the description to a basic diagram that'll help you out. But all you need to know to work through it yourself is 7 degrees. If you cut your test piece to a 7-degree angle and base everything else off that, you can figure this out. With my compound miter saw set to a 7-degree angle and a matching 7-degree bevel, I cut one end off each leg piece. Then, I set a stop block up for the overall height of the stool and cut each leg to final length. To keep the angles facing the correct way, I flipped the leg end for end, then rotated it 90 degrees towards the fence. With this setup and technique figured out, I cut down 8 legs in no time. And why 8 legs, you might ask? Well, that's personal, and you should keep your questions to yourself. I mean, who wants one stool when you could build 2? Moving on to the cross supports that will hold the legs to each other, I took the same setup block and matched the fence angle on my joiner to it. This step isn't technically necessary. Your stool will function just fine without it. I just prefer the look of the horizontal components being parallel to the ground. Since the material for the supports are already cut to width, I made sure to make the same number of passes over the joiner with each one to keep that width the same from piece to piece. Then once again at the miter saw with that 7-degree angle dialed in and my setup block positioned as a stop block, I cut one end off the board, then flipped it before cutting it to length. One of my cross support pieces had a funky knot in it, and I decided to showcase this rather than hide it, so I taped it up from the back side, then filled it with epoxy before setting it aside for later. Once all of the components are cut to size, as long as the angles are cut correctly, the joiner is incredibly simple. I would clamp the pieces down to the flattest part of my workbench and pre-drill pilot holes. Then I would add glue before reclamping and driving in some screws. This is plenty strong, and by clamping the pieces down, I didn't have to deal with anything shifting around while I worked. I repeated this process for each pair of legs, connecting them with both the top and bottom supports until I had 4 sets of legs. Next, I connected each leg set together using shorter cross supports. You could make the overall design have a square footprint, and honestly that's probably easier and more common. But I wanted mine to have a bit more of a rectangular stance. You'll notice I'm only using 1 screw for these top supports. That's because there are 2 screws in the wood on either side of it, and there's just not enough room for that much hardware. But once I get down to the longer piece, I use 2 screws again, since this will also act as the footrest. I used a plug cutter and my drill press to make a bunch of stumpy walnut dowels, then glued them in the recesses left by the countersink bit to hide the screw heads. After the glue dried, I cut away the excess plugs and sanded them flush with the legs. I glued together some chunky tops to make seats, and after cutting them to size, I added bevels on the underside. I started with the matching 7-degree angle, but in this case it just didn't look right, so by the time I was done fiddling with it, I had doubled that angle to 14 degrees. I added a round over to the top of the seat in an attempt to make it more comfortable, then slathered everything in a healthy coat of tung oil. Once that dried, I mounted the seat to the legs by drilling through the top supports straight into the seat. These holes are centered with the grain, so any expansion and contraction will originate at this point, and I won't have to worry about wood movement causing any problems down the road.
Well, as you can see, that nice walnut top I made just didn't last very long. It was just too uncomfortable. It only took about 5 minutes for my butt to go numb and the backs of my legs to hurt from being pressed up against these sharp corners. So I tried to like it for a couple of weeks. It didn't happen. I ended up replacing it with this swiveling cushioned bar stool top. Once I took this off, there was just enough room on the top of this platform to retrofit it with that Lazy Susan mechanism. So I drilled some pilot holes, I ran in some screws, and I attached the new hardware and the new top. And now this is much more comfortable. It actually raises the height up a couple of inches, which is good. It was a little shorter than I really wanted it to, and that was just picking a size and going with it. So now I'm really happy with it. So like I mentioned before, there are plans down in the description. It's not really a plan so much as a dimensioned diagram of this exact stool. But honestly, you don't need that as long as you just remember 7 degrees. That's what all the angles need to be cut at, and then you can just cut them to make it fit what you want. If you want the legs longer, great. If you want your stool to be up higher, just make this shorter and slide it up and put it in where you need it to be. So go ahead and get the plans if you want them to make this exact same scale version of mine, but just remember 7 degrees. And also I have links down in the description for that and the cushion top here. But again, these are everywhere. If you just do a Google search for swiveling bar stool tops, bar stool seats, you'll find something like this. So I'm rambling. I apologize. Thank you guys for watching. Check out the links and we'll see you next time.